The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. The gods had condemned Sisyphus to ceaselessly rolling a rock to the top of a mountain, whence the stone would fall back of its own weight. They had thought with some reason that there is no more dreadful punishment than futile and hopeless labor. If one believes Homer, Sisyphus was the wisest and most prudent of mortals. According to another tradition, however, he was disposed to practice the profession of a highwayman. I see no contradiction in this. Opinions differ as to the reasons why he became the futile laborer of the underworld. To begin with, he is accused of a certain levity in the regards to the gods. He stole their secrets. Aegina, the daughter of Sisyphus, was carried off by Jupiter. The father was shocked by that disappearance and complained to Sisyphus. He, who knew of the abduction, offered to tell about it on the condition that Ephesus would give water to the citadel of Corinth. To the celestial thunderbolts he preferred the benediction of water. He was punished for this in the underworld. Homer tells us also that Sisyphus had put death into chains. Pluto could not endure the sight of his deserted, silent empire. He dispatched the god of war, who liberated death from the hands of her conqueror. It is also said that Sisyphus, being near to death, rashly wanted to test his wife's love. He ordered her to cast his unburied body into the middle of the public square. Sisyphus woke up in the underworld, and there, annoyed by an obedience so contrary to human love, he obtained from Pluto permission to return to the earth in order to chastise his wife. But when he had seen again the face of the world, he enjoyed water and sun, warm stones, and the sea. He had no longer wanted to go back to the infernal darkness. Recalls the signs of angers, warnings were of no avail. Many years more he lived facing the curve of the gulf, the sparkling sea, and the smiles of the earth. A decree of the gods was necessary. Mercury came and seized the impudent man by the collar, and snatching him from his joys, led him forcibly back to the underworld, where his rock was ready for him. You have already grasped that Sisyphus is the absurd hero. He is, as much through his passions as through his torture. His scorn of the gods, his hatred of death, and his passion for life won him that unspeakable penalty in which the whole being is exerted toward accomplishing nothing. This is the price that must be paid for the passions of this earth. Nothing is told us about Sisyphus in the underworld. Myths are made for the imagination to breathe life into him. As for this myth, one sees merely the whole effort of a body straining to rise the huge stone, to roll it, and to push it up a slope 100 times over. One to see the face screwed up, the cheek tight against the stone, the shoulder bracing the clay-covered mass, and the foot wedging it, the fresh start with arms outstretched, the wholly human security of the two earth-clotted hands. At the very end of his long effort, measured by the skyless space and time without depth, the purpose is achieved. Then Sisyphus watches the stone rush down in a few moments towards that lower world whence he will have to push it up against towards the summit. He goes back down to the plain. During that return, that pause, that Sisyphus interests me. A face that toils so close to the stone is already stone itself. I see a man going back down with a heavy yet measured step towards the torment of which he will never know the end. That hour, like a breath space, a breathing space which returns as surely as his suffering. That is his hour of consciousness. At each of those moments, when he leaves the heights and gradually sinks towards the layers of the gods, he is superior to his fate. He is stronger than his rock. If the myth is tragic, that is because his hero is conscious. Where would it be his torture, indeed, if every step the hope of succeeding upheld him? The workman of today works every day in his life at the same task, and this fate is no less absurd. But it is tragic only at the rare moments when it becomes conscious. Sisyphus, the proletarian of the gods, powerless and rebellious, knows the whole extent of his wretched condition. It is what he thinks of during his descent. The lucidity that was to constitute his torture at the same time crowns his victory. There is no fate that cannot be surmounted by scorn. If the descent is thus sometimes performed in sorrow, it can also take place in joy. This word is not too much. Again, I fancy Sisyphus returning towards his rock, and the sorrow was in the beginning, when the images of the earth cling too tightly to memory, when the call to happiness becomes too insistent. It happens that melancholy arises in a man's heart. This is the rock's victory. This is the rock itself. The boundless grief is too heavy to bear. These are our night's Gethsemane. But crushing truths perish from being acknowledged. Thus, Sisyphus at the outset obeys the fate without knowing it. But from the moment he knows, his tragedy begins. Yet at the same moment, blind and desperate, he realizes that the only bond linking him to the world is the cool hand of a girl. Then the tremendous mark rings out. Despite so many ordeals, my advanced age and my nobility of my soul may conclude that all is well. Sophocles, Sisyphus, like Dostoevsky's Kirillov, thus gives the recipe for the absurd victory. Ancient wisdom confirms modern heroism. One does not discover the absurd without being tempted to write a manual of happiness. What? By such narrow ways? But there is one world, however. Happiness and the absurd are two sons of the same earth. They are inseparable. It would be a mistake to say that happiness necessarily springs from the absurd discovery. It happens as well that the feeling of the absurd springs from happiness. I conclude all is well. Oedipus and says, and that remark is sacred. It echoes in the wild and limitless universe of man. It teaches that all has not been exhausted. It drives out this world of a God who had come into it with dissatisfaction and the preference for futile suffering. It makes the fate of a human matter which all must be settled among men. All Sisyphus's silent joy is contained therein. His fate belongs to him. His rock is his thing. Likewise, the absurd man, when he contemplates his torment, silence all the idols in the universe, suddenly is restored to silence. The myriad of wondering little voices of the earth rise up. Unconscious secret calls, invitations from all the faces. They are unnecessary. Reverse to the price of victory. There is no sun without shadow. It is essential to know the night. The absurd man says yes, and his effort will henceforth be unceasing. If there is a personal fate, there is no higher destiny, or at least there is but one which he concludes is inevitable and despicable. For the rest, he knows himself to be the master of his days. At that subtle moment, when man glances backwards over his life, Sisyphus returning towards his rock, in that slight pivot he contemplates the series of unrelated actions which has become his fate, created by him, combining under his memory's eye, and soon sealed by his death. Thus convinced of his wholly human origin, all that is human, a blind man eager to see, who knows that the end of night has no end. But he still goes on. The rock is still rolling. I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one burden again. But Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the god and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. This universe henceforth, without a master, seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain, in itself forms a world. The struggle itself towards the height is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy.